We're excited to have Tom Smarr with us tonight. Tom is our executive director at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. And at this point, I will turn things over to him to introduce himself. Thanks for being with us, Tom.
A great privilege of speaking at your organization. You get to introduce yourself as well. But thank you, Amy. Amy's been terrific. She's amazing at our programs, and I'm so glad she's here to help introduce you and host many of these kinds of lectures that we've been doing. If you haven't seen it in a long time, we have a really nice program guide or magazine that lists a lot of these programs, so it's always fun. Myself, I guess I got to stop talking about Jenkins and I need to talk about the topic at hand tonight. I have a big slide set for us tonight, talking a lot about grasses, and it's sort of an interesting topic for me. I wouldn't say I'm like the absolute expert in grasses, but I've actually been really thrilled and fascinated by this plant group for a long time. And I really enjoy sharing and talking about it. Unfortunately, for my mother, who doesn't like grasses in her garden, I've tried to constantly say, well, we got to add something. We got to add something. And there is a lot of benefit, both from design and ecological in your garden to have grasses. So with that, I am going to start. Oh, I guess a little introduction about who I am. I am the executive director here. But before that, I had over 25 years career as a horticulture director, gardener at various botanical gardens, mostly across the United States. I worked at Garden in the Woods, which is outside of Boston, Massachusetts, where I ran a rare plant garden for a while and then became the horticulture director. And then after that, I worked for the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is the park on top of the Big Dig. And then after that, I went to the High Line in New York City, worked there for a while, which has a lot of grasses, and I'll be sharing some pictures from there tonight. And then also after that, then I did a real big jump. I went over to Louisville, Kentucky, and worked at a 4,000 acre park called the Parklands of Floyd's Fork. It was a very new park, and I got to design it, help with some of the design on it. It was already mostly designed, but I got to help with some of the planting design and got to really experience plants, especially meadows, and working with meadow grasses in a very new way. So all these experiences gave me really interesting new perspective. Here at Jenkins, we don't have a big collection of grasses, but we have a respectable little bit of grasses here and there, because as a shade garden, we have a lot of what I call cool season grasses. So we'll describe all that. Let me get my presentation up. I did that too quickly. I did it in the wrong order. Let me share my screen. And then I'm going to turn that into a presentation. And hopefully everybody can see my slide set. If you can't, just let Amy know. Amy's giving me a thumbs up on it, so terrific. And I am going to go with it. All right. All right, so here we go. We're going to get into this and check this out and see what I've prepared for you. So native grasses for your garden. So a lot of the gardens I've worked for have been native places or grasses, a lot of native plant collections as part of their primary source. So primary plant collections. But I always like to start this out. You know, we think of grass, we often think of lawns, the great American lawn, right? But the grasses are so much more than just a lawn. Or we think of the ball field. Here in Philadelphia, I believe the ball field is an authentic lawn grass. Some ball fields have gone to synthetic fields, but I think, you know, it's an art form of its own to take care of turf grass, and it definitely has its place. Grasses are actually a very important economic crop. If you think about food, the wheat and the oats and all the other great grains that we eat are part of that grass group. And we forget that how important plants are in general economically to us, from the clothes we wear, many of the clothes we wear, to the building products, to food that we eat. I think it's quite fascinating to think about that. Even grasses supporting the wildlife or the livestock that feed us as well. Grass is a common part of our freeways or our roadways. We think about it on the side, but it's not just that roadside plant. When you turn your head, and this is a picture I took last fall when I was traveling out west, But grasses are a part of the complexity or matrix of the native habitat. Here you can see a tree like Opuntia cactus out there, out west, but a really interesting sort of dynamic of cactus and grasses here. But we're going to look at a lot of that. And then grasses definitely are part of our cultural identity. This famous painting by Andrew Wyeth definitely wouldn't have the same quality if this figure, Christina, wasn't sitting in this low grass plain area looking up at the house. So it gives a unique quality. And we think of grasses as very much at plains or different regions of our American landscape. So I think that's such an important part of it. And of course, recently we're seeing meadows and other sort of environments which contain a lot of grass species incorporated in very famous landscapes. Longwood unveiled their meadow some years ago, and it's been quite popular with visitors and the beauty of it. So learning about it, we're going to talk about the benefits of grasses. We're going to talk a little bit about the structures or the taxonomy of grasses. Then I'm going to define a little bit about what cool season and warm season grasses are and represent some species there. We're going to talk a little bit about grass-like plants and why they're a little different. We're going to talk a little bit about great companions as they're part of the matrix, a little bit about designing, a bit about managing, and then some further resources. So a lot to pack into this amount of time. But I really just wanted to give you, I like to have fun with these kinds of talks and be able to give you a chance to really look at and see sort of the cool things that you can look at. Benefits of grasses, there's so many great benefits. And I didn't get a picture of the stability, but right now as we're seeing a lot of soil erosion happening with severe storms. Now, plants aren't going to stop it entirely, but they provide a lot of stability into the environment. Grasses definitely play their role in that. They have a great fibrous root system, which that fibrous root system is also very helpful in aerating and adding organic matter to soil. When we think about soil, it's not just the minerals or the raw organic part or even just the solid part of it, but it has a lot of organic matter in it, and it actually has air spaces in it, which there are critters that help, like earthworms that make air space, but roots are also a big part of creating aeration into our soil system. Foraging, obviously, many critters, including ourselves, eat a lot of grass, not just the grass directly, but the seeds and such. And in habitat, it's a great place for home and shelter for a lot of the very small critters. In fact, some insects will use the grass, and then they're great as companion plants, both in nature and for in our designs. So as I mentioned, habitat here, I love this picture. It's hard to get those great pictures, but this is where the spider webs were strung up in the meadow from grass stem to grass stem. Birds obviously would make nests from it. Some bird species actually nest in grass plains, tall grass areas. That's important for certain species. The root system has been studied quite extensively. Now, this is a lot of different prairie species, but you can see some of the red square plants, and you move up to them, you can see that some of these root systems are going into the ground over 6 feet into the ground. So really adding that, breaking down the soil, adding aeration and adding that organic matter, and how important that is for the environment. I took this picture recently. You can see these grass seed heads here popping up. This is a dune that separates us from the Atlantic Ocean down along the Delaware shore. Grasses are such an important part of holding in not just the sand in the dunes, but the erosion of soil as well. And they're just part of that important system. Food, as I mentioned before, and then just sort of the matrix. So we often will grow those tall perennials in our garden and they flop all over the place because they're designed in nature to grow amongst a matrix of plants. We will stake them or put them up against a wall or something, but here you could see how the plants, it's a lot of Queen Anne's lace and some other flowering plants here, are growing within a matrix of different grasses that are providing mutual support to each other. So I think that's so important. So a little bit about the structure. So obviously we have the grass head at the top. Most grasses are what we call terminal flowering. It is considered a flower, but we think of it often as a seed head. They have a stem. Some of them have sheaths, and that depends on what kind of grass you're looking at. The most important thing I really want to show you is the crown point, this point between the stem and the roots. And that's going to be very important when you're thinking about cutting back grasses. That's where the growth points are, right in that crown area. And if you cut beyond that, that usually injures the grass or even damages it from being able to grow further. So, it's like what we call scalping the lawn. If your mower's goes down too deep into the lawn or even into the soil, it'll scalp and actually damage the grass plants that are in that area. Now, there's a lot of different plants that are part of the grass family, if you will, or families. And often this is a popular adage that a lot of people like to use to think about the differences as they're trying to identify them. So sedges have edges, rushes have round, and grasses have nodes from their tips to the ground. And to sort of demonstrate that, so I'm starting with the last first, the grass. So you can see here how this stem is sort of crooked as you go down. Those are all the little nodes or the little nodules along the stem there that make what we would call grass. And has a very typical, this plant particularly has a very typical what we call grass-like blades here. But this, you can see that different point, the nodes. This is a sedge. This is a Pennsylvania sedge, and we'll be looking at this a little more later on. But often when you fill the edges, it's almost like that kind of paper cut effect. You could almost feel like it would give you a paper cut. Now, grasses can do the same, but sedges don't have those nodes along the stem. In fact, a lot of sedges, not all, but a lot of them have very smooth stems or are very much like a little bunch. So we'll talk about clumping here a little bit. But here you can see this carex. It's very smooth stems, and this is in a pot, so it's a nice little tuft of sedge here. The rushes, this is a juncus here. It's a round stem-like leaf. It's sort of interesting how it's a round like that, and it creates this really nice sort of effect along the water edge. These are plants that definitely, you can see here, it's even raining. This was taken recently it started raining, but this was taken a while ago in the spring, where you can see the rushes here, these the juncus, the common juncus or common rush here has the round stems or round leaves all the way up. So this is really important, where that crown point is like a shortened stem there that's allowing these to come up from. Well, you'll probably be familiar with this in a lot of your gardens. If you ever had to dig up some weedy grasses, you have what we call runners, and they often put out a stolon or a rhizome which runs a length of the ground and will root in. Some crabgrasses, some other weedy grasses will do this. And so we tend to garden with more clump grasses. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we'll talk about clump grasses in a minute, but the advantage of this kind of grass, and some lawn grasses are often runners because they want it to spread around. So there's an advantage to some of these, but most of the garden plants we're going to work with are going to be clumping type grasses. Those are the desirable garden plants. But a runner grass would make a great sort of spread, or sometimes they tend to be shallow rooted, so they're not always great at ground holding, but they can be great at creating a mat or a cover of the space. One of a very famous runner grass, unfortunately, is the Japanese stilt grass, which is right now become a terrible, terrible invasive plant. So I just showed this with you. You can see in the backdrop, it seeds around, it runs around. It's become a real devastation on our roadways and in our woodland environments. But it's a great example of what a runner would look like. Now, our clump grass or our tuft grass, they stay as a neat little clump. They don't put out runners. They tend to grow from the center. Now, sometimes these will die in the center because that's probably the older part of the plant, which can be a little bit problematic. But I think it makes for a nice sort of even little lump, I hate to say lump, but even little sort of grouping into the garden. Just to briefly talk about flower heads, you do have sort of commonly three types of flower heads. And I only sort of share this with you because when we start thinking about the artistic part of grasses in our gardens, it's sort of nice to be thinking about sort of a solid sort of flower head, a sort of more airy and open sort of our flower head, or more of a almost finger-like or digitate inflorescence here, where you get this sort of different shapes. Now, grasses have a variety of these kinds of fluorescence, and you sort of get a chance to see that. The cattail, definitely a very solid flower head that you can distinctly see that. It's very tight, very together. This scirpus is a much more open type of head. It's much more airy. It flows and bobs in the wind and the air with it. And then something like this, this is a blue stem, a big blue stem flower head, where it's just sort of more like finger-like pieces where you can see actually the pollen hanging off there, sort of like corn. If you've ever seen a corn tassel, it sort of does the same thing. And here, sort of another example where they can be all kinds of different forms and shapes. And that's sort of what gives the uniqueness of the diversity. I think of grasses, I mean, they're just as, almost feel as diverse as a lot of the perennials, other kinds of perennial flowering plants we work with. And I think they just sort of bring that beauty to it. Soil, there's no one type of soil or one type of grass that grows in all types of conditions. So, it's just like all these other kind of plants where you really want to look at what are the requirements of those different kinds of plants. And a good reference guide is always great. A lot of the plants we're going to be talking about today will grow in good, healthy garden soil, loamy soil with good drainage. Just not super dry, moisture, good moisture retaining, but they're different plants. Like we saw the cattails, they like to grow that. They like to actually grow in water itself. But a lot of the other grasses, they like to grow in the ground, forest floor, or out in the sunny environment. So I'll touch on that as we're going through this presentation. Cool season grasses. These are grasses that are going to have active growth during cool temperatures. So these are your grasses that like to grow in the spring or maybe in the fall. They don't like summer heat. Often I would find these kind of grasses growing in maybe a woodland garden environment because they like the shade. They do sort of active growth before a lot of the sun comes out, in, like a lot of spring ephemerals would, but they're trying to do a lot of they want to stay cool. They don't want to be baking in the hot sun or be growing in the hottest part of the summer. So a popular great woodland grass is the bottlebrush grass. This is a grass that can get anywhere from a foot to 3 feet tall. It's got this beautiful seed head that looks like bottlebrush, hence its name. The Elamis hystrix, it's changed its name some years ago, as a lot of these plants have. But I just really like that effect. Here's a group of the bottlebrush grass growing underneath a small tree in a meadow environment, but still in the shade, not in the hot summer sun, which is nice. The sedges are probably one of the more popular groups of plants we think of as cool weather types of grasses. And I'm using the term grasses very generic here. So a sedge is a sedge, a carex, but it's a great this plant, this is the pictures taken in the sun, but this is a springtime picture where the sedges, many of the desirable ones to grow are clump forming, would be planted out. In the early spring, they have these great I think they're great flower heads. They sort of could be green to dark brown. Grasses don't have these big floriferous, often we think about as big, colorful seed heads or flower heads, but they do, I think, have their own unique beauty to them. And sedges will spread a little bit as they spread out and create these nice flowy areas. I love the effect of the Pennsylvania sedge and some of the other sedges that are more of a fine blade sedge. They give this beautiful, easy flow. Some of the other woodland plants, here you've got foamflower growing in, tiarella growing in with this sedge. The foamflowers are almost finished here, but really nice growing. There's a Carex appalachica, which is a little bit longer or flow. This is only the one picture I had, but I've seen it in other places where it's been a little more upright. This was taken on a hillside, and it just sort of created a really nice sort of mat. One of my favorite, and I don't have a great picture of it, unfortunately, is the seersucker sedge, or the plantain leaf sedge. It has these great, it's a wide blade sedge, and it's unfortunately, these are terrible pictures. I wish, oh, and that's the wrong name in there. But you can see there, it almost has these little folds like seersucker fabric would have. And I think it's just a great plant. It's just been one of my favorite sedges and could be really great. I need to get a better picture of that. And in the blue bunny, or the Carrick's sedge here, it's almost a bluish silver color, broadleaf or silver sedge. I just think this is a fun one. We had this on the Highline. This is the only picture I could find. You never think about, sometimes when you're putting these kind of talks together, all the years of your photos, and you're thinking, where can I find these? But here you can see there where I was shooting, actually, the irrigation head, make sure it was working, and you can see the sedge in the background there, getting a little drink of water up there around the rails of the Highline, train rails. But it's a nice soft green. Now, some years ago, when I was at Garden in the Woods, we decided to create a sedge lawn. We took Pennsylvania sedge and actually created a lawn. Now, this wouldn't be a lawn you would routinely mow, but it was a lawn that you could let grow in. It's got sort of a stop growth. So it's not like your lawn, your yard lawn, which would get taller, but it would stop at a point and it would stay this sort of soft green. You could casually walk on it. You wouldn't be able to use it as aggressively, as hard as you would other types of lawn, but it could be a nice lawn to really enjoy, especially like a ground cover area. And here's some other pictures of that. They expanded on the lawn idea a few years later. We took that same Pennsylvania sedge and did an understory planting at a woodland garden I helped design in Kentucky. And here you can see the pots going into the ground. A little bit later, you can see this is soon, about a year after, around the tree up there was a year after we planted it, sort of started becoming soft. And this was a newer planting down here with a different kind of sedge. I think that was Carrick's Burnii down there. And then in the middle here, you can see that was Carrick's actually Tangenea, which was the seersucker sedge. We did a broader planting of that. So a little bit of different texture there. Different picture a little bit later, sort of more grown in sort of effect. This was another planting. We took a sinkhole and created sort of an interesting art form. So we took the coral bells, or the heuchera right here, and planted it in sort of a spiral. And then we did the Pennsylvania sedge in the same way, so we could get a little bit of a texture effect. Now, here we had some soft soil that kept eroding, and so it was a little harder to get it to root in and want to get established. So that took a little bit more longer challenge. We had to keep planting in there, but eventually we were able to get a good planting. So this was about a year and a half, maybe about a year and a half to 2 years after that planting. So really started to get some nice spread in there. And we actually did take the pots. We got 1 gallon pots and actually divided them up into halves or even to quarters and planted them around like plugs in the space. And it really helped cover the area nicely. If you're interested in learning more about sedges, like Mount Cuba is right now doing a sedge study at their site, at their garden down in near just north of Wilmington, Delaware. They do some great studies. They just finished a hydrangea study and we published that report, which is available on their website. But they're also doing the grass sedge one right now, or I think it's just sedges, and they have it in shade and in sun, so they can really understand how they perform and how they do. Excuse me. Warm season grasses. So your warm season grasses are going to be your grasses that are going to want to grow in the heat of summer. They like warmth. In fact, during the spring, you're going to think this grass is dead and not doing anything. And then once it gets some sun and some warmth, as we get later into May and June, these grasses are going to really start activate and start really being something. The gamma grasses are popular in a lot of gardens, just tend to be a little shorter, well, shorter in the sense it gets about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. I love this Bouteloua. Its seed heads sort of look like they're flying, almost like dragonflies in the air. I think that's a lot of fun. I think one of the more popular ones is the little blue stem, the schizocariums. They can be very bright blue. In fact, there's some cultivars out there that even are brighter blue sometimes. But this is a really fun grass, sort of a medium height grass of, probably gets up to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet tall there. I love, you can even see there's a little bit of red, orange in there. And I found this picture, I thought it was great paired with Joe Pye weed, which I think is really wonderful. And then in the fall, it gets this brilliant sort of orangey color. And I think that's such a fun thing for it. It's such a big transition. A lot of plants have those big transitions, and it's got the little seed heads along the stems there. But I think it's just sort of fun. This color is sort of brilliant. It goes from blue to this brilliant sort of pinkish red color, which can be really fun. Now, coloration is really going to depend on how much light and moisture or dry it is. Now, little blue stem really likes it dry. It's sort of a tough plant. It will often grow in poor soils along roadsides. In fact, some of the problem of taking a straight species blue stem and planting in your garden, it gets all floppy. And so there are some new cultivars out now that allow it to stand better in richer soils, our garden soils, which tend to be a little richer. One famous cultivar is Standing Ovation. That was one of the first ones that came out. So that really allows it to stand up. But it often will grow in sort of this massed fields, like you can see here, cedars in the backdrop. I just think it's a lot of fun. A grass that's close to my heart, wild oats, sometimes known as northern river oats, sometimes known as sea oats. This is a great grass. The grass blades sort of look like lawn grass in some ways, but I think it's just sort of a real fun grass. It's playful in the air, the wind as it moves around. And I think that's one of the beauties of grasses. They have a lot of this great flowing. I wish I had some video on that to show you how these move, or a lot of these grasses move in the wind. I think it's just sort of really amazing. And then as the fall comes on this time of year, you're going to start seeing those seed heads becoming more brown, this sort of cinnamony or even a little darker brown than that coloration. Now, this is another one of those grasses that's going to get probably about 3 feet tall. It can be a little aggressive. Here at the high line, you can see these sort of brown, these sort of patches in here. That is the river oats grass growing in there, sort of creating these patches, but it can seed around, especially if it's happy in the soil. So some people will cut it back early in the season to sort of prevent those seeds from going everywhere. Or I like to use it in arrangements. It's a wonderful dried grass for dried flower arrangements. Looks great. Or you can just plant an area you don't mind it being a little bit of thug. And I think that's sometimes appropriate. You can find those thug areas. Sargassum nudens, or Indian grass. This has that beautiful feathery seed head on it. It can be really fun late season grass head to see in the garden. A little bit taller, so it's going to get about 4 feet to 5 feet tall, even probably more like 4 feet tall in the garden. But this is something I would put into the backdrop of an environment. But I just love that sort of nice rich seed head there. And you can see it here in the background of this meadow, how it flows out to that sort of featherness up to it, which I think is really fun in a meadow like this. This is Calamagrostis, Carl Foster, which is, he was a famous plant breeder many years ago. Feather reed grass, which is a great grass. I love it against this stone wall, gives this beautiful formality. It stands very upright, which is a lot of fun. And then you could see it here. This is actually in a garden at Longwood Gardens in the backdrop there behind this sea holly, which I think is sort of fun. It creates a sort of different effect at this time of year. Switchgrass, another very popular group of plants. This is a north wind, which is got a little bit of more yellowing color or light green colors in the. This can get pretty tall. Around here, it probably would get about 5 feet tall. I've seen this plant get as tall as 6 feet tall. When I was in Kentucky, it grew like a tree, it felt like there. It got very tall, so we were pruning it like a hedge sometimes, cut it back mid-season even and let it resprout. But it's a really fun grass. One of my favorites is Shenandoah, which is the has this beautiful red in its leaves blades, which can be a lot of fun to pair up some plants with that and have that be a filler in there. And in heavy metal, which is this nice rich blue color. So you're getting this taller, very blue plant in there, which can be a lot of fun, especially when you're powdering it or matching it up with sort of nice greens or thinking of other colors as well. And in here you can see it in the sort of winter, no snow around, but we're going to talk a little bit about this in a few minutes, but about how I like to actually leave my grasses up for the winter. We did a little bit of tidying in this this garden. In fact, we did some bulb planting in this garden. That's why we left the panic and the switchgrasses up. But I did this planting where we had it wrap around this bench. It was already partly that way, and I had it finished off. So you felt like you were enveloped in this space even more. So you felt like you had more of a backdrop, and people on surrounding sidewalks didn't see you necessarily sitting in there, which I thought was fun. Prairie dropseed. This is a plant people don't often notice, but it's probably a plant you've seen many times. I love, again, beautiful feathery seed heads to it. This is a little more broken up here, but it's very popular. Actually, Chanticleer has this wonderful meadow almost entirely just of this here. So it's a really wonderful plant to see. The grass is very soft. Something you'd want to plant by plant. I tried seeding this in once and it didn't really work all that well. And then on the highline, we had it here as well. You can see these sort of patches along here and even in the very foreground here. The middle plant here we're going to talk about in a few minutes is Amsonia. That's a perennial, flowering perennial plant. Very fine foliage, very similar to some grasses, but it's sort of a nice companion here, especially with the different coloration here on the highline designed by Pete Udoff, which is his books I would recommend if you're interested in perennial planting with grasses. One of the things that was always interesting about the prairie dropseed is you walked along, especially this time of year, people would stop and ask about this sort of burnt sugar smell they would find, just smell in the air. And it was actually the prairie dropseed. It has this nice sort of fragrance. And it's not something you can pick up like an herb and rub it and get the smell. It just sort of wafts in the air here. So you can see it here in the mid-ground. Picture's a little brightened out. And then there's a tall grass back here we're going to talk a little bit about. It's big blue stem. Muley grass or pink muley grass, which is another grass that I think is a lot of fun, is not much to see earlier in the season, but then later in the season it explodes with this beautiful pink cottony seed head. And this is great as a filler in the garden. And I love how it captures the moisture, the dew or the rain in the flower heads as well. It's a lot of fun. And here you can see it really filling in a nice patch. This is how I like to plant a lot of grasses sometimes is patches or in a matrix, sort of dotting around at different places. Here you can see on the highline the Cotinus here with the, or smoke bushes here with the Amsonia, and that pink muley grass up here to the left, I think is really nice. Big blue stem, this is a hard grass to photograph. It's like sometimes these grasses are very hard to photograph and try to capture their true spirit in a garden or environment. A lot of big blue stems I tend to see in garden or in meadow environments, but they can really be dominant in grass. It gets very tall. I've seen this plant get as tall as 8 feet tall in a really rich soil, but it could get up 5 to 6 feet tall. I think it works really well with tall, other tall perennials, which can be great. But I think this is a lot of fun. And you can see it here. We got the prairie dropseed in the front, and then a little bit of little blue stem here, and then some aster here as well. So just talk a little bit about grass-like plants as well. Some people sometimes think of these plants as grass-like, but they're not really, but they're sort of fun to think about and to think about their shape and texture. The horsetails, the scouring rush can be a lot of fun. They have that sort of node-like effect, but they're not a grass. They're actually sort of considered fern allies or fern type of plants in the fern groups when you study and look at ferns. Irises, those nice big blade-like leaves, are actually not a grass, but they have these big, beautiful flowers on them. And I think they're great had that great texture. The Iris cristata, which is the dwarf crested iris, I actually did a planting with the seersucker sedge, the Carex plantagenea, and this together, which was sort of a fun effect. It had some a little bit of different texture, but it's very similar texture effect with the leaves. And then you had some things blooming, and it felt like a fun little sort of river effect. And then a misnamed common name, which is the blue eyegrass, is actually not a grass at all, but resembles one very much as the Cicericium angustifolium, which is a fun flowering plant. Amsonia, we looked at this earlier, especially the thread leaf blue star Amsonias is a lot of fun here. And can be really enjoyable to see. And it looks great with plants and with other grasses as sort of a great mound. Talking about companions, I think it could work for a lot of things. I just have some nice pictures here with some mix. This is at actually Stoneleigh Gardens, just down the road near Villanova University. Beautiful old state garden that is now run by Natural Lands. They did this sort of fun planting with a lot of different perennials, but especially this grass, the different grasses here with the Echinacea pallida, the pale purple coneflower. I just thought that was a lot of fun. This whole meadow was probably about 3 feet tall, and I thought that was just a lot of fun. Prairie drop seed in there. Liatris, the blazing stars. Here it's in a very dried state. This was a winter shot with the grass with you could see the seed heads of the prairie of the blazing star in the background. Ironweed, it can be a lot of fun with grasses. Ironweed is one of those plants that cows don't eat, or a lot of critters don't eat, but that royal purpleness can be great. And then its dried seed heads, which are more of a cinnamony color, could be great in the garden. The New England aster, your purple asters, look great within the grass and the meadow environment. And these, we often see New England asters as nowadays they're sort of produced along with annual chrysanthemums as sort of pom-poms, as the purple version of a chrysanthemum. But they're very big, billowy sort of plants that can really use some support by grasses when grown in more of a garden setting, which can be really magical with some grasses. Rattlesnake master. My label fell off that one, but rattlesnake master, which I think is a Iridium, which is a great one. Here you can see this is a little earlier in the season. The rattlesnake master hasn't fully developed, but you can see in front of it is the river oats or the chasmanthium grass coming up right in front there. But I think it's a fun sort of plant could be put with a lot of different kinds of grasses. Goldenrods across the board. We all think of the evil Canadian goldenrod, nothing against Canada, but just it's got the common name of that Canadian goldenrod, which seeds around a lot. But there are a lot of great goldenrods out there. You could do a whole session just on goldenrods, and we're talking about all the great goldenrods to garden with. But they're just sort of perfect with grasses, and I unfortunately don't have a great picture with it. Your butterfly weeds or your milkweeds work very well. I mean, really, almost any kind of perennial that will really can really work well with the kind of matching up of the grasses that you want. And here's swamp milkweed. I just love its effect, especially when it gets the seed heads breaking apart with the grasses later in the season. Bee balms, it's a natural. This is a bee balm in a meadow environment. The grasses are just starting to come up because the bee balm blooms a little earlier and the grasses are forming. You can see some big blue stem in the background there, right in here. Liatris. I mean, you can just really sort of envelop. I think grasses can very nicely envelop and work with things. The purple prairie clover, it's a natural with shorter grasses in a more sunny meadow area. Here it's on the highline. We grew it against this fence, so I don't have it with a picture with grasses on it. The Rebeckias, this is the black-eyed Susans are really great. I talked about big blue stem earlier, a lot of the compass plants. This one's sort of leaning on the railing here at the highline, but it would be a great companion with other grasses. Here's another of the Sulfiums, the rosenweed or dock here, which could be bellow, and as the flower stalks come out, they can sort of lean on and against the different grass clumps. A few others, the Veronicastrum, Culver's root. Some thugs, the pyrocanthums or the broadleaf mountain mints. These are real thug plants, and so planting them with some grass thugs like chasmanthium or the prairie dropseed or even Little blue stem can be a lot of fun with that color and sort of the texture differences. And of course, this is why I put labels on everything, because I always forget all these things. But I keep wanting to say columbine, but I know it's not. False indigo, there we go. False indigos here, baptisias. This is a great plant. It can be, this here you can see more, it's become more of a little bit of a monoculture here, but it was some, you can see some perennials. Well, that's actually a perennial there, but some grasses peeking in, so you can really create a nice patch for that. Designing with grasses, I think it's about creating great texture and color and combinations. So these are many of all the plants that we just talked about a few minutes ago. But how do you create some great things? So, at Chanticleer, they have this great planting in the gravel garden with the Nucella, the Mexican feathergrass. It's sort of tufted along with these great perennials, and adds sort of this silvery foliage. So one of the things I haven't mentioned is grasses are great at reflecting light, and I find that they just, not only they fill in volume in space, but they can also be really great at creating reflection and in the garden, and especially in the evening. I talked to a gardener once who said he really specialized in creating a landscape that him and his wife could enjoy in the evening, where the light reflected off of the sunset, and they could really enjoy that. So I just love what they've done here at Chanticleer. The highline, definitely we did what Pete Udolph's famous for, is the matrix planting, where you're doing grasses and then perennials within that sort of matrix of creating it. And you can really see that here in this sort of late fall picture. We can really see the grasses and the perennials that pop through it. Prairie drop seed with that billowy aster there, and it's a big blue stem in the background. Your Carl Foster grass again with some perennials in the front there. Gara, there we go. I knew the name was in my head. Non-native grass, but I just wanted to show the implication here. We had this garden with, and they put a big variegated grass here, but I thought it was just sort of fun, this group, the texture change from the rounder leaves or broader leaves with the fine blades of a grass. And then sometimes when you maybe can't grow a grass, you're growing it in a small space and you can't support it with other plants or walls, you can almost make the plant supports themselves be the art. And this is just basically rebar that's bent in place to hold up these panicums. And I thought that was very playful and fun. And then I love this planting. This was in a park in the background. You can see there's a parking lot back there, but this layered of plants and perennials in the fall to create this different color variations. Very nicely put together. I thought that was sort of fun, sort of planting there. And then again, back to the light, I just wanted to reflect, sometimes it can be a shadow and sometimes it can be the brightness. Now these are not perfect shots, but it sort of gives you the effect of what we're trying to talk about there a little bit. Managing grasses, I think, are really important, in my opinion, to leave up for the winter. In fact, a lot of books will recommend, and garden advice will be, go cut your grasses back in the very early spring. So we're talking like February, March, go in and we cut your grasses back. Why is this? Well, it's good for the crown. It protects and insulates the crown of the plant, but also grasses are a great environment, not only food source for critters, but also habitat for critters that overwinter. Birds, small mammals, or insects will overwinter within their stems. And so, I think this is sort of a lonely little switchgrass out here, but I think it really, and it adds an interesting color combination out into the garden as well, and can be great. Here we got some grass with some stems of a hibiscus, native hibiscus here, and I think it just provides sort of an interesting contrast. Now, it will get beat up over the winter, and eventually, as you get into spring, it'll be sort of beat up and be ready to cut. Something that can be fun, this can happen out of grasses, this can happen out of some of your perennials, is what we call ice flowers. These are really sort of fun. This is where the moisture gets into the stem and pushes out early in the morning. So these are only seen early in the morning. It's like ice cotton candy. And it's a lot of fun to see these. There's a few plants that are really good at producing this, but I thought it was just sort of fun to throw in here as I was talking about winter and the importance of leaving stems and things. These are broken off stems. But the grasses, I think, are so important. This is a beautiful meadow of field of broom grass here. But as the spring emerges, you can see some of the spent grasses out there. Now I would get to it before we got any flowering plants blooming out there. I would go in and either mow this space down, or you can cut it back if you're at your garden. So here this woman is cutting back. She's using some pruners here. And again, it's very important not to get down into that crown environment. You want to make sure you're leaving a little bit of a tuft there so you're not cutting all the way down and damaging it. You're not going to change. Some people think if they cut a grass different heights, it's going to change the height. The grass is going to grow to the height it is designed, or its species will be, right? It's not going to be shorter. Now, if you cut it mid-season, you may change it a little bit, but that's not going to happen in the early spring like this. So here they did some cutting. They probably did a combination of hand cutting and some weed whacking here. But you got a variety of tools. These are mostly hand tools. I love the old shears, almost look like sheep shears here. You can use that. The hand sickle or the large sickle, head shears or pruners. Just make sure they're really good and sharp. I like to wear long sleeves. Sometimes you can get those warm days in the spring where you want to wear short sleeves and go out, work out in the garden. But when I'm working around grasses, they can be, they're not poisonous or anything, but just can be a little irritating. They can have some insects in there that can be a little irritating. So sometimes it's nice to just have long sleeves on when you're working with them. And sometimes you can cut them, you can get a nice patch of them. We did an art exhibit many years ago when I worked at Garden in the Woods. We actually harvested grasses and we created these neat grass tufts that we put in the garden in the summer. And this was part of an art exhibit called Art Goes Wild that we worked with a popular garden designer and artist named Gary Smith. And so this was a fun exhibit to work on. And this was one of the exhibits where we did these grass tufts, mostly made out of a little blue stem because of that blueness, and it worked really great as a contrast against the bright green of the garden in the summer, but it was a lot of fun. But as I mentioned, you can weed whack. Just again, you don't want to get down too low. You can burn your grasses. Now, this is sort of a bigger picture of like a meadow burning, but burning can be very natural. So one of the reasons you're trying to burn is you're trying to actually remove too much layer of grass. So you can create too much of a thick duff layer. And this can happen sometimes in lawns if you don't have good critters eating up or good decomposition going on. So burning can be a very natural process for burning a meadow or burning an area. Now, if you do any of this, you should always check with your local fire authorities and rules. Some people will even take little hand torches, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But you get really great renewal growth, especially if you have perennials in that meadow environment. So some of you may own some bigger areas or sort of a little meadow in the area. This could be a great way of doing it. Valley Forge, thousands of acres of meadows, but they manage it. They don't burn necessarily. They bale their meadows, and that could be the same effect as burning. Basically, you're trying to remove the organic matter off and then use it somewhere else. So often if I do cut it, I would compost it or use it as a mulch somewhere else, which is really important. Here at Chanticleer, they have their prairie drop seed meadow. This would be sort of late season as it's sort of finishing up. And they actually go in here. This is taken a little bit after, but you can see this brown or black on it. Well, they actually went through and actually burned their, I don't know if they do this every year or not, but they actually burned a lot of their tufts here, and that helped renew the growth of that plant. You don't want to burn too intently. You don't want what's called a super hot fire. If you saw the picture, remember the pictures a few minutes ago I just showed you, it was a quick moving fire. It was just burning sort of the loose splitter and then moving on, because we get too intensive of a fire sitting straight on the plant too long, it would damage that crown and damage the plant entirely, and you get really nice refreshed renewed growth out of it. But I like to cut. I tend, in my garden environment, I would just cut it back and remove the grass and not make sure there's not too much of a thatch building up. You want a little bit of organic matter to cover the ground because you don't want it completely exposed, but I don't want too much of a thick thatch growing up over years and years. I happened to be walking at Bartram's garden last summer, and I came across this. I guess this is a whole thing, meadow braiding. And so I thought that was fun. In the summer, you get your meadows too high, you can go in and make art out of it. And I've shown you a few things that are sort of artistic and fun, but I thought this was sort of fun, this meadow braiding. This is really, it's fun. I can't even, I never had long hair, so I never got into braiding, unfortunately, but it's, I thought that was just a really interesting effect, an interesting art form. But grasses, meadows, individually used in your garden, I think it can be a lot of fun. It's a great plant group. Some resources I like to recommend. There's some great books out there. Rick Dark wrote a wonderful encyclopedia of grasses that have native and non-native grasses in it. William Kalina did a book on native ferns, mosses, and grasses many years ago, and I believe that's being republished. It looks a little different than this cover, but it's being republished now. And then recently, a few years ago, Ted Elliman revised the book that Lauren Brown had done and added photographs to it. And that's amazing, sort of more of an identification resource, which I love. I mentioned the Pete Udoff books. I think they're great. He loves perennials, flowering perennials and grasses, and really works with planting those together. There's many more books than these two, but these are two that I tend to turn to a lot and look at. If you're interested in the food side of grass, my good colleague, Bree, the plant lady, has written 2 great books on food growing. That's a whole nother topic, but gardening with grains is a fun one where you're using a lot of these food grasses. So I just throw that in there. But do come visit us. I think fall is one of the best times of year at the gardens. Our garden shop has a lot of different plants in it. Some of them grasses include as well that are available, and members definitely get their 10% discount for that. We have a lot of nice gifts in the gift shop as well. And yeah, I just invite you to come out and see what we have going on. And yeah, that's where we're at. Whew, I got that all in the time allotted. I feel very fortunate. So I see there's some questions there, and I'm glad to answer some questions.
Thank you, Tom. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we can put us back side by side. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that talk. That was awesome. There is so much more to grasses than you think.
My talk was almost twice as long as that, and I was like, oh my gosh,
yeah.
I cut this down. A lot more slides than I wanted, but there is, and I think gardening is one of those fields. There's so much information out there. I think that's why those of us who work in horticulture feel so privileged to be in it, because there's always something new. And grass, I mean, I could teach a whole 6 lecture course on just gardening with grasses in general. So it's a lot of fun. What questions do we have?
Yeah, so I will go through and read them to you, and feel free to answer what comes to your mind. So thinking back through the grasses that you mentioned, which ones are the most deer resistant?
Oh, that is a good one. And I am not up on my deer resistance. Steve has a great talk on deer resistance. I think, do we have that on recording, or maybe not? I think we did that.
Yeah, I don't think for the public.
Recording. But we, I know Steve Wright does a great talk on deer resistance. Our plant labels, when you come in, they have deer resistance on them. And there's a great book that was written by Ruth Clausen and Greg Tepper on deer resistance. So that would be a great resource on it. But that's a tough one. I couldn't say offhand. Unfortunately, they're great foraging plants, so probably a lot of grasses probably get foraged at. But
right,
the more delicate grasses are probably more vulnerable to be noticed than maybe the bigger, tougher ones, like the switch grasses. You probably wouldn't notice it as much once they're well established.
So another scenario for you, someone who has a black walnut tree, can you suggest any grasses that would grow under a black walnut?
Yeah, interesting about black walnuts. So black walnuts are known to be allelopathic, which means they hinder the growth of other plants, especially the reseeding or the germination of it. But they found that only really affects meadow plants. So if you have a black walnut and it's upgrowing, and it's got already starting to cast some shade, you probably can get away with growing some of those sedges, some of those cool season grasses underneath it. It won't be shouldn't be affected as much. So people have done some nice gardens around black walnuts.
Great. While we're hitting you with random scenarios for grasses, what would you showed that wonderful slide with leaving the seed heads up around the bench that you had designed. What other grasses would you suggest specifically for winter interest?
Oh, I think almost all the grasses are great for winter interest. The sort of warm season grasses, I think, make for great winter interest. The cool season grasses, I don't find hold up, but I may be a little wrong on that, but your sedges and such, you don't notice them as much, but these, and I could be wrong on that, but I think that your warm season grasses can be great as winter interest, and they just produce, great reflectiveness. The little blue stem is great as winter interest, just a variety of them. It's hard to sort of label them all out, but I find a lot of the grasses hold up very well through the winter. At the Highline, we had a little joke. Sometimes the stems would break off, and we'd actually poke holes in the ground and stick the stems back into the ground because it was so important for us to have that fall and winter landscape there. So you can cheat a little bit if it breaks off at the ground for some reason and sort of poke it back into the ground. You can get like a little tool to do that, a little dibble or something like that, like an ice pick, an awl or something.
Horticulture secrets revealed. Just to backtrack slightly, I had two people who have chimed in just about the deer resistance since we've asked that question. One said that since deer are browsers, they generally leave grass alone. And we had another person mention that sedges and rushes aren't preferred by deer. Deer also don't eat switchgrass, Indian grass, or the blue stems in her experience, and she has a lot of deer on her property.
Oh,
so
great.
there's hope for you out there to grow grass. But when I put the resource list together, I'll also include Greg Tepper's book with deer resistance, so people can check that out. Thank you for those who chimed in about deer resistance.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Great to have everybody's experience in this.
I know, exactly. Do you have any thoughts about purple lovegrass?
I was going to add purple lovegrass in here, and I didn't have any good pictures of it, unfortunately. So purple lovegrass, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Eragrostis it is the most boring looking plant most of the year until you get into the fall when it starts flowering, and it's sort of like the pink mullygrass. It has these big, diffuse, sort of beautiful cottony purple. Some of it, there are even some white varieties of it, cultivars of it. It's great, but it looks like a roadside weed. So it's sometimes a little hard for some people to tolerate in the garden, but I'm a big fan of it. And it grows a little shorter. It tends to be more like around a foot, maybe 2 feet at maximum along the garden. But it looks like some type of like crabgrass or something, unfortunately, and it sort of gets a bit of a bad shake as how the plant looks, but then it looks great. So yeah, I do like purple lovegrass. It grows a lot along roadsides. You'll sometimes see it. You'll be driving along in the fall and you're like, look down, I was like, what's all that pink over there? It's purple lovegrass blooming.
Nice. This question is about meadow management. So they said that over the years, the tall grass meadow that had switchgrass, big blue stem, and Indian grass, they've almost disappeared with Canada goldenrod taking over. You showed a slide of burning meadows. Would that be a good method to try to take down the Canada goldenrod to try to encourage the warm season grasses to return?
That's a good question. I've not had to, in my meadow experience, I never had to battle Canada goldenrod. Actually, I was trying to decrease the grasses themselves. The big blue stem would be sometimes too ambiguous. But burning can help with some of those kinds of species managements. It may also have to be, you have to go in and actually remove some of the Canada goldenrod manually, which is not an easy thing because it can sometimes root down deeply, or spray it out if you feel comfortable using herbicide type spray very selectively, sort of pull it out of some spots. I saw a meadow many years ago that was like that, and unfortunately, in my experience, I've had to deal with that one, but it's a great one. Actually, I would like to look into it because Canada goldenrod, if you don't know this, is actually an invasive weed in other countries around the world. So our plants are weeds in other parts of the world, just like other plants that come from other parts of the world come here become invasive weeds. So it is something. It does happen, and I think pride burning would be helpful. Again, you always got to make sure you're checking in and making careful attention to fire management. We don't want a meadow burn fire. You need to have a fire plan and a management and get permission from the township or county you're in every time you're doing any kind of burning.
Yes, that's very important information to share. The last part of her question was, in that process, would she mow the meadow first and then burn, or do you just burn it at the height that it is?
Yeah, I think it's best to just sort of, this is a good question. I haven't had a lot of experience at burning. I've done it mostly on a small scale. I just was part of that one big burning, and I wanted to get into it more. I had staff that were really crazy about it. You can go get certified in all this. Sometimes I know they will cut down sections of it to burn, but you tend to, I think you want it standing more than you do want it laying, because the meadow may not burn well if it's laying. It's sort of a smothered sort of effect. So I think you want it more standing, but you do want to be careful you're not getting something that might get too tall as it's burning through. You want it to sort of move through quickly and burn off the excess organic matter. You don't want it to sit still in one spot for very long. So I think that's the idea, get it to move through quickly. But I would recommend checking into more fire management and burning recommendations. I just sort of introduced it here as a way of experience of working with some small spots of it.
All right. Does anyone else have questions for Tom out there? If you got to add a new grass to Jenkins, what would you add and where would you put it, Tom?
I think it would be fun to add a few warm season. We don't have a lot of warm season grasses in it. Not many people realize we do have a meadow, what we call the Browning hillside. So you can see it from Azalea Hill when you walk around the backside of Azalea Hill. There's a meadow there, and I think there are some nice grasses in there. I need to go back out and look at it this fall. I should have ran down there to take some photographs. So I was looking at things, but I think it'd be fun to add a few different kinds of switch grasses in there. And we have some little bluestem, I think, up by the education center and a few other places, but I think it would be fun to add a few more different kinds of sedges and things around. Steve's been great at curating and figuring out how to get different plants in the garden, but I think it would be fun to play with some different plantings to add some different things. But there's only, yes, we only have 48 acres, but it's like, oh my gosh, we gotta have more to garden with. So we're trying to figure that out, and that's some of our future planning as well, Jenkins.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, anyone else with questions? Before we say goodbye, we will mention, I know Tom mentioned the garden shop a little bit at the end of his presentation, but again, this is the perfect time to start thinking about fall planting, the perfect time of year to get plants in the ground. They establish their root systems and are just going to be ready to go for you in the spring. So please come visit us. Our garden shop is open daily from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it will be open to, what do you say, like mid-October?
The outdoor,
maybe late October,
area,
yeah.
The perennials will sell until about mid-October. We'll have to get that more detailed date from Helen and Steve. What happens is there's a certain point in October where it's not good to be planting your perennials out anymore because they will just get heaved by the frost in the rest of the season. So there's a certain point where we pull the perennials, but trees and shrubs can still be planted. So we'll leave those out usually until maybe early November. So we'll continue to sell those plants, but we just have to make sure we bring them in at a certain point because if it gets too cold, the roots get too vulnerable in the pots on top of tables. So so we close down everything by probably early November for sure, late October, early November. But yeah, come out, check out what we have. We'll keep informing you on what we got. Amy and Stephanie, who manage our social media and our communications, always do a great job keeping you all informed. And the garden shop itself, plants and houseplant, they're gifts. nature themed gifts and such will be open year round. So if you're looking for some great winter gifts or even early beginning of the year gifts, there's some great things in there in books.
Well, Tom, thanks again for sharing your information with us tonight and taking time out of your, I know, very busy schedule to be with us. And Tom touched a little bit about a couple invasive grasses in his presentation. And next month's third Thursday lecture will touch a lot on invasive insects. So if you want to join us next month on October 20th, our topic is the forest pests and firewood connection. So please join us to learn more about invasive pests and how that relates to firewood. So that should be, I think it's firewood, something with like a national, the national holidays that pop up. I think it's like Firewood Awareness Month or something like that. So we'll learn more about all of those details. But Tom, thank you again for being with us. And thanks to those of you who are still with us. Stay to the end of those questions. And thanks to those of you who asked questions tonight. And hopefully we'll see you guys all sooner than next month. Hopefully you'll come and shop a little bit at Jenkins if you're local, and join us maybe for some other educational programs that we have. So Tom, thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you guys all soon. Good night, everybody.